The Earth Summit was everything Captain James Raines had come to expect from interstellar diplomacy. A polished charade of formality and veiled suspicion. James adjusted his uniform collar for what felt like the 100th time. His restless gaze sweeping over the assembly of delegates gathered in the sprawling Geneva Conference Center. He caught snippets of conversation in half a dozen alien languages as translators whispered in their headsets. The air buzzed with a mixture of caution and curiosity. At the heart of the crowd stood Intera, the Selnaran representative. She was tall and elegant, her skin a pale lilac that shimmered faintly under the soft conference lights. Her long, tapering fingers clasped a crystalline data tablet, her sharp eyes scanning the room like she was memorizing every face. Her expression betrayed no hint of emotion, only the precision of a diplomat. To James, she was the embodiment of alien aloofness, and he doubted she'd be impressed by much of anything on Earth. He was proven right when she finally turned her gaze on him. "You must be Captain Raines," she said in perfect English, her tone neutral. James extended a hand. "That's me. It's a pleasure to meet you, Representative Intera." Her head tilted slightly, and she glanced at his hand as if it were some unusual Earth relic. She did not take it. Instead, she placed her tablet under one arm and regarded him coolly. "I was told you would be my escort during my stay." "That's correct," James replied, lowering his hand. "I'll be showing you around, answering any questions you have, and making sure you're comfortable." Intera's lips curved into a faint semblance of a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Comfort is not my primary concern, Captain. I'm here to observe your people, learn your customs, and report back to the Selnaran Council." "Sure," James said lightly, "but part of that observation might involve some creature comforts. I hear you've been traveling for quite some time. A hot meal and a good night's sleep might do wonders for any interstellar visitor." She gave him an unreadable look and then turned away to survey the room once more. "Perhaps. Shall we proceed?" James gestured toward the exit. "Of course. This way." As they walked, James attempted to break the silence with small talk. "So, have you had much opportunity to interact with humans before now?" "Not directly," Intera replied without looking at him. "Most of our information comes from long-range surveillance and trade negotiations. Your species is interesting." "I'll take that as a compliment," James said with a grin. It was not intended as such. Her tone was even, but he thought he detected a hint of dry humor beneath it. "Humans are a volatile species, unpredictable, fascinating in their contradictions." "Well, I'm not sure that's flattering either," James quipped. "But I appreciate your honesty." They reached a private transport vehicle waiting outside. The driver, another human officer named Lieutenant Grayson, gave James a quick nod as he opened the door for Intera. Grayson was a younger man, sharp-eyed and eager. "Captain, Representative," he greeted them, standing at attention. "Lieutenant, this is Representative Intera of Selna," James introduced. "She's here to learn about Earth's culture, so let's give her a good first impression." Grayson flashed a brief smile. "We'll do our best, sir." "Representative Intera, it's an honor." Intera inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement before stepping into the vehicle. James and Grayson followed, settling in as the transport glided through the city streets. Inside, the mood remained stiff. James exchanged a look with Grayson, who raised his eyebrows as if to say, "What did you expect?" "Representative," James said after a moment, "I thought we might start with a tour of some cultural landmarks. Art, music, maybe a stop at one of our museums. Does that sound acceptable?" "Acceptable, yes," Intera said, her tone still measured. "Your people place great importance on artistic expression. It is a trait we find peculiar." Grayson leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "Do Selnarans not have art?" "We have a different relationship with creativity," Intera replied. "For us, artistic expression is not tied to emotion. It is a means of exploring logic and form, not an outlet for feelings." James glanced at her, curious. "So you've never looked at a painting or heard a piece of music and felt moved by it?" She shook her head. We do not rely on emotional reactions to interpret the world. It would be inefficient. Grayson smirked. Sounds like a lot less drama. Indeed, Tara said. Her sharp gaze turned toward James. Humans, however, appear to thrive on emotional turmoil. You let your feelings dictate many of your decisions. James chuckled softly. Well, you're not wrong. But sometimes those emotions lead us to do remarkable things. Maybe you'll see that for yourself. She raised an eyebrow as if unconvinced. Perhaps. The conversation drifted into silence, and James found himself studying Tara more closely. Her calm, controlled demeanor was a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos he associated with human interaction. He wondered what it would take to break through that exterior, to see if there was any warmth beneath the surface. But for now, she remained an enigma, as inscrutable as the stars. When they arrived at the museum, James stepped out first and offered Tara his hand again. This time, after a pause, she placed her fingers lightly in his. The contact was fleeting, but James couldn't help noticing how cool her skin felt against his. As she withdrew her hand, he thought he caught the faintest flicker of curiosity in her expression. The museum's grand entrance loomed before them, and James gestured toward it. Let's see if we can find something that interests you. Tara inclined her head. Lead the way, Captain. Chapter 2. A Cultural Exchange. The sprawling Earth History Museum was designed to overwhelm. Towering displays and intricately arranged artifacts filled the vast, vaulted halls. James had visited once on a school trip years ago, but seeing it again with Tara gave the experience a strange new flavor. He found himself watching her reactions more than the exhibits, wondering how humanity's history of art and culture would appear through her alien eyes. This is an early example of human sculpture, James explained as they stopped before a weathered, marble statue. Its smooth surfaces gleamed under carefully placed lights. It was created thousands of years ago, before modern tools or machines. Tara stood motionless, her gaze traveling across the contours of the figure's face, the curves of its draped garments. You revere these images of yourselves, she observed. Well, not all of them, but we respect the artistry that went into making them, James replied, scratching the back of his neck. They're a way of connecting to the people who lived before us. Tara didn't respond right away. She studied the statue as if dissecting its meaning layer by layer. It is unnecessary, she said at last. A mere representation of what once existed. What purpose does it serve now? Grayson, who had quietly joined them after parking the transport, spoke up. It's not about utility. It's about beauty. About telling a story. James nodded. Yeah, even if it's just a glimpse. These works remind us of where we've been, what we've dreamed of, and what we can strive for. Tara's head tilted slightly. A curious notion. You find meaning in this aesthetic residue. James smiled. I like the sound of that. Aesthetic residue. You're catching on. Her eyes narrowed, though not in anger, more like concentration. What I find intriguing is not the object itself, but your attachment to it. That is what I will study. Study away, Grayson said, gesturing toward a nearby gallery. There's plenty more where that came from. They moved on, weaving through exhibits that chronicled humanity's journey from ancient cave paintings to modern digital art. James pointed out details, how the use of perspective evolved, how materials changed, how each era reflected the values and struggles of its time. Grayson chimed in occasionally, sharing tidbits about his own favorite artists. It became a kind of group tour, with James and Grayson bouncing ideas off each other while Tara absorbed everything in silence. At one point, James stopped in front of a painting from the Romantic period. It depicted a storm-tossed sea, a tiny ship clinging to the crest of a monstrous wave. This one's always been a favorite of mine, he said. It's about survival, about holding on no matter how rough things get. Grayson crossed his arms, his brow furrowing. You sure? I always thought it was more about humanity's place in nature. Like, no matter how tough we think we are, we're just a speck in the grand scheme of things. James shrugged. Could be that too. Art's open to interpretation. Tara stepped closer to the painting, her head cocked as she examined it. "I see neither survival nor human insignificance," she said. "I see a sequence of visual elements designed to provoke a response. Light, shadow, motion, all calculated to elicit emotion." "Exactly," James said. "That's what makes it powerful." "But why rely on emotional provocation?" Tara asked. "Would it not be more effective to convey information clearly and logically?" Grayson chuckled. "If you're looking for logic, art's probably the wrong place." "Maybe," James added, "but emotions, yours, mine, anyone's, are part of what makes us who we are. Art isn't about clear answers. It's about asking questions and feeling something." Tara seemed to consider this, her expression still unreadable. "You assign great value to this process of emotional inquiry." "Absolutely," James said. "It's how we connect, how we understand each other on a deeper level." Grayson shot him a sideways glance. "You getting philosophical on me, Captain? Someone's got to balance out your wisecracks," James replied with a grin. They continued their tour, lingering in some galleries and breezing through others. Tara occasionally posed questions about technique, symbolism, historical context, and James did his best to answer, though he didn't consider himself an expert. Grayson, meanwhile, provided a steady stream of light-hearted commentary, helping to keep the atmosphere relaxed. By the time they reached the final exhibit, a vast installation of holographic projections and soundscapes, Tara seemed more at ease. She still held herself with the same composed demeanor, but James noticed a subtle change. She engaged with their explanations more readily, asked more questions, even offered a few observations of her own. It was as if she was beginning to see humanity not just as a species to study, but as individuals with their own stories, struggles, and triumphs. As they stepped back into the daylight, James glanced at Tara. "So, what did you think?" She paused, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains that framed the city. "It was illuminating," she said. "Your people's attachment to these creations speaks volumes about your nature." "That's what we were hoping for," James said. "To show you what makes us tick." Grayson smirked. "And maybe, just maybe, show you that humans aren't so bad after all." Tara turned toward them, and for the first time, her mouth curved in what could almost be called a smile. "We shall see, Lieutenant. We shall see." Chapter 3. An Unexpected Rescue. James woke to a piercing alarm that sent adrenaline surging through his veins. The artificial calm of the research outpost had shattered into chaos. Overhead, lights flickered as a distant rumble vibrated through the walls. He scrambled to pull on his boots, his mind racing. Something was very, very wrong. "Tara!" James shouted as he ran toward the common area. "We need to move." The alien diplomat appeared in the corridor, her expression as composed as ever, though her lavender eyes flickered with unease. "Captain, what is happening?" James glanced at the trembling ceiling panels, then back at her. "Some kind of seismic event. We need to get outside now." As they hurried down the hallway, the outpost's automated voice blared warnings. "Structural integrity compromised. Evacuate immediately." "Great," James muttered. Couldn't have picked a better day for a sightseeing trip. Lieutenant Grayson caught up to them, breathing hard. "Captain, I just got a report from engineering. The outpost's foundation is..." Before he could finish, a violent tremor knocked all three of them off their feet. The lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. James grunted as he hit the floor. His first thought was to reach out for Tara, who had fallen nearby. "Tara, are you all right?" James called, straining to see in the dim emergency glow from his wrist communicator. "I am uninjured," came her calm reply. "What is our plan?" "Get topside, away from the buildings. Grayson, you lead. I'll stay close to the representative." Grayson nodded, already pulling out a flashlight. "This way." The ground continued to shift beneath their feet, making every step treacherous. James kept a steady hand on Tara's arm, guiding her through the jagged corridors. Dust filled the air, and the sound of cracking metal and distant shouts echoed around them. They reached the main exit just as another tremor hit. A chunk of the ceiling gave way, crashing down between James and Grayson. James pulled Tara back, shielding her as debris rained down. "We're okay," Grayson yelled from the other side. "I'll find another way out. Meet you topside." "Got it," James shouted back. He turned to Tara. "Come on. There's an emergency hatch around the corner." Tara's typically calm demeanor finally cracked. "You are putting yourself at unnecessary risk." "It's called doing my job," James said, giving her a wry smile. "Let's move." The emergency hatch was jammed, but James managed to force it open. They emerged into a scene of utter devastation. The once serene landscape surrounding the outpost was now a fractured wasteland. Trees lay uprooted, and a massive chasm had split the ground not far from their position. In the distance, other survivors scrambled toward evacuation shuttles. James turned to Tara, his voice firm. "We need to head for that clearing. It's safer." She hesitated, glancing back at the unstable structure behind them. "You humans have an unusual willingness to risk yourselves for others. And you aliens have an unusual knack for debating in the middle of a crisis," James said. "Come on." They started across the rugged terrain, the tremors growing weaker but still present. At one point, Tara slipped on loose gravel, and James caught her before she could fall. For a brief moment, their faces were inches apart. Her normally composed expression showed something else, uncertainty, maybe even fear. "Thanks," she said quietly, straightening. "No problem," James replied, equally subdued. They resumed their trek without further comment, though James couldn't shake the memory of that fleeting vulnerability in her eyes. When they finally reached the clearing, emergency personnel were organizing evacuees. Grayson was already there, waving them over. "About time, Captain. Thought you'd decided to go sightseeing again." "Very funny, Grayson," James said, his tone more relieved than annoyed. "Let's get on that shuttle." As they boarded, Tara glanced at James. "You placed my safety above your own." James shrugged. "That's what partners do. We look out for each other." She seemed to consider this, her gaze lingering on him longer than usual. Then she nodded and took a seat. The shuttle lifted off, carrying them away from the shattered outpost. James leaned back, letting out a long breath. They were safe for now. Chapter 4. Unraveling Prejudices. James was surprised by how quiet the nature reserve was. In a world teeming with activity, the remote location felt like another planet. He and Tara walked side by side, the only sounds being their footsteps on the packed dirt path and the occasional trill of a bird in the trees. "You must think we're pretty backward," James said after a while. "All this fuss about showing you our culture, when you probably have things we couldn't even imagine." And Tara glanced at him, her features as composed as ever. "Your world is different from mine. I find it interesting, not backward." "Interesting, huh? That the diplomat's way of saying strange but kind of endearing?" James chuckled, breaking the tension he felt growing in her presence. Tara didn't respond immediately. Her hands, as always, were folded neatly in front of her, her posture straight. "Your world is more chaotic than ours, but chaos has its own logic. I am trying to understand it." "Good luck with that," James said, half joking. "We don't always understand it ourselves." The path led them to a small clearing, where sunlight streamed down through the canopy. James took a deep breath and gestured for her to sit on the smooth, mossy stone that protruded from the earth. "I thought you'd appreciate a spot like this," he said, sitting down nearby. "It's peaceful, isn't it?" And Tara sat, though she kept her back straight, hands resting on her lap. "It is quiet, tranquil, yet even this stillness feels foreign to me." James leaned back, resting on his elbows. "What's your home world like?" Her gaze moved to the sky. "Selna is orderly. Every structure is designed with precision. Our cities hum with energy, but it is a controlled energy. We do not have places like this, wild, unkempt. Our nature is carefully maintained, in harmony with our constructs." "Sounds efficient," James said. "But don't you ever just let loose?" Let things happen on their own. We prefer not to, Tara said, her tone matter-of-fact. Uncontrolled elements lead to uncertainty. Uncertainty leads to difficulties. Sure, James said, sitting up. But isn't that where the best things come from? From taking risks? From not knowing what's going to happen? Tara tilted her head. You believe chaos produces positive outcomes? I believe life isn't just about order. It's about surprise, about discovery. Sometimes the best things are the ones you didn't plan. She looked at him for a long moment. You speak of emotions again. Yeah, I do, James said with a shrug. Because they matter. To us, at least. And I think they matter to you more than you let on. Her brows drew together slightly, but she said nothing. For a while, they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. You know, James said after a while, I think you feel more than you think you do. You're just not used to it. Tara's gaze snapped back to him. I do not rely on emotions. But you have them, James pressed gently. You care about your people, about doing a good job, about seeing what we're all about. Caring does not require emotional attachment. It is a logical imperative. Okay, but what about now? James asked, leaning toward her slightly. What about sitting here, talking like this? You could have stayed in the conference room reading reports, but you came out here. Why? Tara seemed taken aback by the question. She looked away, her gaze settling on a patch of sunlight dancing on the ground. I wish to understand your world more fully. And maybe something else? James asked, his voice softer now. Maybe you wanted to tie in everything, even your own beliefs. It is unsettling. Unsettling? James repeated with a smirk. Or refreshing? She hesitated, then said, both. Well, James said, I'll take that as a win. They spent a little longer in the clearing, talking about smaller things. The plants around them, the sounds of the forest, and the sunlight filtering through the leaves. For the first time, the conversation didn't feel like a diplomatic exercise. It felt like a conversation between two people, learning each other's perspectives. As they made their way back to the main path, James brushed against her arm slightly, not even realizing he'd done so until she looked down at the point of contact. He pulled back quickly, muttering an apology. It is all right, Tara said, her voice calm. She didn't move away. James glanced at her, trying to read her expression. You're full of surprises. You know that? So are you, Captain, she replied, her tone lighter than before. They walked on, the silence between them no longer awkward, but companionable. Chapter 5, Closer Still. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension. It was meant to be a simple debrief, Tara's findings so far, James' input on the cultural exchange. But the words had quickly turned sharp. James leaned back against the edge of the table, arms crossed. Across from him, Tara stood perfectly still, her posture rigid. You don't understand, she said for what felt like the third time. My actions are dictated by logic and duty, not sentiment. James threw up his hands. And yet, every time we're out there, whether it's looking at art or walking through nature, you're not some emotionless robot. You feel something, don't you? Tara's gaze flickered, and James could have sworn he saw the faintest hint of uncertainty. But then she said, feelings are not relevant to my work. You are projecting your own nature onto me. Oh, come on, James said, pushing off the table. You keep acting like you're above all this. But I see it. The way you stop to ask questions, the way you look at things like you're trying to figure them out. That's not just logic at work. You're curious. You're, I don't know, engaged, interested. Tara folded her hands neatly in front of her. Curiosity is not the same as emotional attachment. Fine, then call it curiosity, James said, stepping closer. But it's something, and I think it's worth admitting that you feel it. Her expression hardened, but there was no denying the pause before she spoke again. You presume too much, Captain. James shook his head. Maybe, but you don't have to keep pushing me away just because you think you should. Tara turned toward the small viewport, staring out at the rolling hills beyond the cabin. The silence between them stretched until James thought he'd pushed too far. "I do not understand your persistence," she said quietly, still facing the window. "It's not about persistence," James said, his voice softer now. "I just think there's more to this, more to us, and I think you feel it too." She didn't answer right away. When she finally turned to look at him, her expression was guarded, but her gaze was searching. "Why do you care what I feel, Captain?" James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I think you're more than just a representative from some distant planet. I think you're someone worth knowing. Someone who's worth trying to understand." For a moment, she simply looked at him. Then, without a word, she stepped closer. Her hand, usually so reserved and deliberate, brushed against his arm, just briefly. It was enough to make James stop breathing. "Perhaps," she said softly, "I do not fully understand myself." James managed a small smile. "Well, that makes two of us." She studied his face as if searching for some hidden truth. Then, very slowly, she leaned in. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was hesitant, almost as if she wasn't sure what she was doing. James met her halfway, their lips meeting in a tentative, careful kiss. It was brief, just a moment before she pulled back. But when she did, her expression had changed. There was no more hard line of control, no more guarded detachment. Instead, there was something softer, something new. And Tara looked down at her hand, which had somehow found its way to rest lightly against his chest. I do not know what this means." "It doesn't have to mean anything right now," James said. "We don't have to rush. Just let it be what it is." She nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on him for another moment before stepping back. The distance returned, but it felt different this time. Less like a wall and more like a quiet understanding. "I must consider this," Tara said, her voice steadier now. "I need time." "Take all the time you need," James said. He moved back to lean against the table again, giving her space. "I'm not going anywhere." Her lips twitched, almost a smile. Then she turned and left the room, her steps as deliberate as ever. James stayed where he was, his heart still racing from what had just happened. It wasn't clear where this would lead, but for the first time, he felt like they weren't just colleagues or cultural exchange participants. They were something more, something real. Chapter 6. Defining the Bond. The sun had just started to dip below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the secluded garden. James stood by the low stone wall, arms resting on the rough surface as he stared out at the rippling pond. The scent of blooming flowers filled the air, blending with the faint hum of distant insects. He heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him and knew it was Tara before he turned. "You've been out here for some time," she said, her voice calm, almost neutral. But James thought he heard a trace of something else beneath the words. Curiosity, maybe. Concern? "Just thinking," he said, giving her a small smile. "Figured you could use some space after everything." And Tara moved closer, though she kept a deliberate distance between them. "I am not accustomed to this." James nodded. "Yeah, I got that impression. But you're here and that's a start." She tilted her head, studying him. "You are remarkably patient, Captain." "Comes with the territory," he replied. "You don't make it far in this line of work without learning how to wait." "I see." And Tara looked out at the pond, her lavender skin catching the warm light of the setting sun. "You said before that this, whatever it is, does not have to mean anything right now." "I have thought about that." "Yeah," James prompted, straightening slightly. "Yes." She hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "I do not understand all of the emotions involved, but I know that when I am with you, my thoughts are different." "Different how?" James asked, his voice gentle. She turned to face him fully, her hands clasped in front of her. "I find myself considering things I never considered before. Small things. Your gestures, the way you speak, even the expressions on your face. It is unsettling, and yet, I do not wish to avoid it." James felt his chest tighten, but he kept his tone steady. "That sounds like a good thing, doesn't it?" "Perhaps." She took a slow step closer, her gaze never leaving his. You have made me question what I once thought was certain. I am not sure how to proceed. Sometimes, James said, stepping toward her. The best way to proceed is to just take it one step at a time. No big plans, no rush. Just see where it goes. Terra's lips curved slightly, almost a smile, but not quite. Humans are very good at navigating uncertainty. We've had plenty of practice, James said with a chuckle. But it helps if you have someone to navigate with. They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Then Tara reached out, her hand hovering near his arm before finally resting lightly on it. James didn't move, didn't speak, just let her set the pace. I do not know if this is right, she admitted, her voice softer now. But I want to try. That's all I'm asking, James said. No pressure, no expectations. Just, let's see what happens. Her gaze met his, and for the first time James saw a hint of vulnerability there. Not weakness, but something raw and real. She nodded slowly, her fingers curling just slightly against his sleeve. Very well, Captain. One step at a time. James smiled. Call me James. James, she said, testing the name. Her lips curved again, and this time it was unmistakably a smile. They turned back toward the pond, standing side by side as the last light of the day faded into twilight. For now, that was enough. Chapter 7. A Crisis of Faith. James sat in the briefing room, the low hum of the ship's systems barely registering as he read the latest report on the negotiations. His eyes flicked over the words, but his mind kept wandering to Tara. He closed the report and let out a long breath. He knew something was wrong. The way she had withdrawn over the past few days wasn't just a diplomatic coolness. It was something deeper. A knock at the door drew his attention. Lieutenant Grayson stuck his head in, his expression serious. Captain, you got a minute? Sure, James said, waving him in. What's up? Grayson hesitated, which wasn't like him. It's about the representative. James sat up straighter. What about her? Grayson closed the door and leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. I overheard some of her delegation talking. Sounds like her people aren't happy with how close she's gotten to you. There's talk of pulling her out, sending someone else in her place. Pulling her out? James repeated, his voice sharper than he intended. Why? Grayson shrugged. Apparently they think it's compromising her judgment. They don't like the idea of her getting too human. James felt his jaw tighten. And she knows this? I think so. She's been meeting with them privately. Might explain why she's been so distant lately. James ran a hand through his hair. Thanks, Grayson. I'll talk to her. Grayson gave a nod and left, leaving James alone with his thoughts. He stared at the closed door for a moment, then stood and headed toward Tara's quarters. When he reached her door, he hesitated. His hand hovered over the panel before he finally pressed it. The door slid open, and Tara looked up from her seat by the window. She was still as poised as ever, but her eyes held a weariness he hadn't seen before. Captain, she said, her tone polite but distant. What brings you here? James stepped inside, the door hissing shut behind him. I need to know what's going on, Tara. Is it true your people are thinking of pulling you out? Her gaze shifted away from him. It is a possibility. Why? James asked, taking a step closer. Because of me? Because they believe my judgment has been compromised, she said quietly. They fear I have become too involved. James frowned. Too involved? What does that even mean? You're doing your job. You're building bridges, finding common ground. Perhaps that is not enough, Tara said, her voice softer now. Perhaps they are right to question my suitability for this assignment. James crossed the room, stopping just short of reaching for her. I don't believe that. I don't believe you do either. Tara turned to face him, and for the first time, he saw uncertainty in her expression. I do not know what I believe, she admitted. Everything I was taught, everything I thought I understood about myself, has been challenged since I met you. And that's a bad thing? James asked. I thought you were here to learn, to understand us. Doesn't that mean rethinking some of what you thought you knew? She shook her head. It is not so simple. My role is to remain objective, to report without bias. If my superiors perceive that I have formed a personal connection, they will no longer trust my judgment. James took a step closer. And what about what you want? What do you trust? Tara met his gaze, her eyes searching his face. I trust that you have shown me a different way of understanding the world. But I do not know if that is enough to defy my people's expectations. James sighed. So what happens if they pull you out? You go back to Selna. Pretend none of this ever happened. I do not know, she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. I do not know what happens next. James reached out, resting a hand gently on her arm. Then don't decide now. Let them talk, let them threaten. But don't let them take away what we've built. Tara looked down at his hand, then back at him. You speak as if this bond is more than it is. James gave her a small smile. Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. But that's for us to figure out. Not them. She didn't pull away. Instead, she stood there, letting his words settle. For the first time, it seemed like she was truly considering the possibility that she could choose her own path, that her actions didn't have to be dictated by others. I will think on this, she said after a long silence. But I cannot promise you anything. That's all I'm asking, James said. Just think about it. Think about what you want, not what they want. She nodded slowly. Very well, Captain. I will consider your words. James stepped back, giving her room. Thank you. As he left her quarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She hadn't made any promises, hadn't given him a clear answer, but she had listened. And that was enough for now. Chapter 8. The New Path Forward. The council chamber was quiet, the tension palpable as Tara stood before her superiors. The Selnaran delegates sat in their customary semicircle, their pale, shimmering skin reflecting the soft ambient light. Their faces were inscrutable, their expressions carefully neutral. But Tara could sense the weight of their judgment in the air. Representative Tara, intoned the High Arbitrator, his voice low and measured. We have reviewed your reports and have observed your actions closely. There is concern among this council that you have allowed personal relationships to interfere with your duties. How do you respond to these allegations? Tara kept her stance firm, her hands folded in front of her. I have carried out my mission with the utmost dedication. The connections I have formed were not a matter of indulgence but of necessity. If we are to understand the humans fully, we must engage with them as they are. A ripple of quiet murmurs moved through the council. The arbitrator raised a hand, and the chamber fell silent again. You believe these interactions are justified? They have provided insights no sterile observation could offer, Tara replied. The humans are driven by their emotions and their connections. By forming a bond with them, I have gained a perspective that data alone cannot provide. It is through these experiences that I can present a fuller, more nuanced understanding of their culture. Your reports indicate a close association with Captain James Rains, another delegate said, his tone sharper than the arbitrator's. Do you deny that this relationship has influenced your actions? Tara hesitated for only a moment. I do not deny that Captain Rains has influenced my perspective, but that influence has allowed me to see the humanity behind their actions, their motivations, their desires, and their fears. This is not a failure of duty. It is the essence of our mission. The council exchanged glances, their murmurs more subdued now. Finally, the arbitrator leaned forward. You have always been a model representative, Tara. That is why this council finds these reports so troubling. We expected you to remain above such entanglements. With respect, arbitrator, Tara said evenly. Perhaps that expectation was flawed. To engage with another culture is to risk change. I have done my duty to the best of my ability, but to truly understand the humans, I could not remain distant. That would have undermined the very purpose of my mission. There was a long silence. The arbitrator sat back, folding his hands. Your reasoning is noted. We will deliberate further on this matter. Tara inclined her head. Thank you, arbitrator. She left the chamber with a calm exterior, though inside, her thoughts churned. The council's decision was beyond her control now. All she could do was wait. James was waiting for her in the observation deck, his arms crossed as he gazed out at the stars. When the door hissed open, he turned. His expression was hard to read, a mixture of relief and worry. How did it go? He asked. And Tara moved to stand beside him, her gaze following his out into the void. They have yet to decide. But I believe I made them understand my position. That's a start, James said. I know this wasn't easy. No, it was not, Tara admitted. But I have learned that understanding often comes from discomfort. James glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You sound like you've been hanging around humans too long. Perhaps I have, she said, allowing the faintest hint of a smile in return. For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the stars their only witnesses. Then James spoke again. If they do pull you out, what happens then? I will return to Selna, Tara said simply. But I hope it does not come to that. I would rather continue this work. Continue learning. James nodded. I hope they let you stay. We've got a lot more to figure out. Indeed, she said softly. I have much to learn still. James looked at her, his voice quiet. And what about us? Tara met his gaze, and for once, she allowed her calm facade to slip just slightly. I do not have an answer for that. Not yet. But I would like to find one. That's good enough for me, James said. He reached out, lightly touching her hand. She didn't pull away. In that moment, they both knew that whatever the council decided, something had changed. The connection they had formed couldn't be undone. It might be tested, strained by the decisions and politics of their respective worlds. But it was there, a quiet, steady presence that neither of them could ignore. As the ship drifted on through the endless stars, James and Tara stood side by side, uncertain of what the future would hold but willing to face it together.